One evening in my flat, I was lying in bed. It was about 3 a.m. in the morning. I felt my light go on. As I turned over, there was just a guy's face just in front of me. He'd broken into my apartment. Ultimately, you need to fight for your life. Breathwork really helped me release that on a somatic level and on a mindset level. When I realized how powerful it was, I was like, I have to share this medicine. I knew that there were people around me that were suffering. If they could try breathwork, how would they feel? It's this amazing mix of science and spirituality. We're able to access different levels of the divine. People will meet loved ones that have passed away and they have messages for them. On a scientific level, oxygenating our blood, we can increase our creativity by up to 500%. Going into the subconscious with breathwork and really figuring out why my soul was put onto this earth, what it felt for me to be free.
If people understood what breathing actually does on a fundamental level, would we all practice it every day?
That's what kind of blew my soul open, and I was like, wow, I actually feel liberated and free.
Joanna Davis, welcome to the Deeply Aligned podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Super excited about this. We met a couple of weeks ago with the workshop that you and our friend Ray facilitated, The Alchemy of Purpose. And I felt like I took so much away from that. Like I mentioned to you here, before the camera started running, that you told me a few things with the astrological birth charts that I kind of sensed was always there, but I kind of wanted the confirmation to feel like that's who I really am. And that's, kind of remembering myself in a way. So let's talk about that remembrance of the self. What does it mean to remember who we truly are?
Wow, great question. I personally feel, for me, a remembrance of myself is really being able to meet the deepest parts of myself with love and with acceptance. So I only truly believe that we actually liberate ourselves and move into a true space of freedom when we're able to meet those parts of ourselves that we so often hide. So it can come through many ways, right? Liberation, it can come through learning about your birth chart and learning about what that holds and the beauty and the magic that holds. But also it can come through things like shadow work, for example, where you look at what parts of your ego are keeping you safe and how you can remove that to then come back into a space of self.
Hmm. For those people who don't know you yet, who are you?
So I'm Jo, and I am from the UK, from England, and I'm a breathwork guide. And I like to take people on what I like to call breathwork journeys. So not so much essentially facilitation, but more so of a journey back to themselves. So a real understanding and remembering of who they are at a soul level and what their soul wants them to explore in this lifetime. So I work with a few different modalities, one being breath work, another one being bodywork, and then the final one being astrology. So they're three beautiful tools that you can then piece together and ultimately create your own experience out of that as well.
Beautiful. We're going to go into all of those modalities in details. How did you get here to where you are today with breathwork and all of these modalities? Do you mind telling us the
Sure.
story?
Yeah, absolutely. So I was always very spiritually inclined when I was younger. I come from a family that dabbled in tarot and astrology, and my mum would always sit me down and she would read horoscopes to me from very young. So it kind of started to fuel that journey from a really young age. And then I decided to travel the world. So I was traveling to places like Thailand, Vietnam, and I was learning a lot about spiritual practices. And I was quite heavily into Buddhism at the time. And I really came into a space of finding myself through these modalities. So the yoga journey started, and that was the first time that I really felt presence
Mm.
in a practice. And it was a time that I thought I can just be completely alone on my mat and there's nobody else around. And, I can just come back to self. So it began with yoga. Then it moved into becoming more and more fascinated with astrology, but I wasn't quite there yet that I wanted to pursue it as a career. So it was kind of still in the background. And then I moved to London and I actually just completely forgot about all of these amazing modalities and just went straight into the grind. And I was working in media and something just constantly felt misaligned. It felt like I was pushing and I wasn't in alignment, and I was working from 6 a.m. till 9 p.m. and I was dissociating on the weekends because I didn't want to face work during the week. So the universe then said to me, like, you've got to leave. Like, I had a realization that I needed to go and find something different. But my ego was actually like, no, like, you're not doing that. You're going to stay in London. You're going to build a life here. You're going to be really successful. And then one evening in my flat in Hackney in London, I was lying in bed and it was about 3 a.m. in the morning. And I felt my light go on. And as I turned over, there was just a guy's face just in front of me. And he'd broken into my apartment and I didn't know what he was going to do in that moment. It was this feeling and this rush of ultimately, you need to fight for your life. And I was in a state of shock. But weirdly, I had this moment where everything rushed through me and it was almost as though the divine was like, this is like life or death. Like, you have to do something about getting this guy off you. And it's strange what kind of comes to you in that moment, because immediately I thought, I need my phone as my lifeline. So I grabbed it and I threw it across the room under the desk. And then we were in this fight for a long time, me and this guy, and I can't quite remember the ins and outs of it, but I remember essentially running for the door and he ran after me. And weirdly, in those moments, obviously these downloads and messages from what people might have told you in the past about safety start to come to you during that time. And my dad used to work in the police and he would come up behind me and he'd be like, what are you going to do if someone attacks you? And I'd be like, a teenager at the time. So I'd be like, don't talk to me. Like, that's just so boring. Like, bore off. And he was like, no, no, like, you need to know. Like, he'd be like, this is like life or death. And he was like, whatever happens, I want you to essentially go for the eyes. So he was like, I want you to like dig your fingers into the eyes and that will keep you safe. So weirdly, in that moment, that download dropped in and it was the only way that I could get this guy off me. And then as that happened, he ran out the door and he left. But that was the whole catalyst into my whole breathwork, spiritual awakening journey, because I couldn't sleep at night. I couldn't talk to anyone. I was dissociating through not even feeling like I was on the planet. I was just in a completely different world. And I'd walk down the street and I'd be like, I'm going to get attacked at any moment. So ultimately, it then led me on this path of real, true healing on a soul level. It was like my soul was like crying out for me to take a different journey that wasn't medication. And I booked a retreat. And that's when I found breathwork. And it was the path to my whole healing journey.
Yeah. Wow. Super scary, super uncomfortable. I'm sure traumatic in many ways.
Yeah.
That those, yeah, lasting effects basically. But also incredible in a way that it became this new shift for you to search for healing that trauma. And that kind of, I always love the saying of your mess becomes your message. And it sounds like that was truly the case for you.
Absolutely, yeah.
I heard you also say that there was always a this part of you that wanted to be free.
Mhm.
What does it actually mean to be free?
I think I always used to believe and feel that freedom came from all of these external things that we so often seek or that our ego seeks. So the money, the job, the car, the house. And recently, I could catch myself coming into those moments again with my ego where I was like, if I made this bit of money, I'd feel really good. And then I caught myself and I was like, actually, no, the true meaning of freedom to me is being able to talk, for example, like this openly and vulnerably about the experiences that I've been through, and also those deep, dark parts of me that I've always suppressed and haven't wanted to meet. So, for example, when you move through an experience as a human, like heartbreak, and you might feel shame around that. And so often we suppress that and we push it down. But actually, it's really about meeting and accepting and loving those parts of ourselves to bring us into a state of freedom and liberation so we can live as whole and understand that everyone else is also exactly the same. So we all have those light and dark parts. It's just coming into acceptance of that. So when you're able to admit that to yourself, to me, that's what kind of blew my soul open. And I was like, wow, I actually feel liberated and free.
Mm. Do you remember if there was a pivotal moment, like a one moment in time that became a big shift, or was it more gradually?
I think for me, it was more gradual. So I think there were moments where I'd go through and I'd catch my ego and I'd be like, I'm acting from ego and not soul. And then it would be that remembrance of you've been and you've done that journey before, like it's time to come back to self. And I think we're always going to have our ego that creeps in and it tells us that we need to be doing one thing and it tells us that we need this external validation. But ultimately, we're on this planet to experience Earth and to live, right? And
Mm.
I think it's so important to remember that.
At what point in your journey did you become a breathwork facilitator?
Mm. So it was after I took my first breathwork session on the retreat, and I was doing breathwork on a more regular basis then. And it was really healing me to the point where now, when I think back to the experience with PTSD, there is no tension in my body. And breathwork really helped me release that on a somatic level and on a mindset level.
Mm.
And when I realized how powerful it was, I was like, I have to share this medicine. I have to share this medicine with everybody else because I knew that there were people around me that were suffering, that were moving through things like PTSD, sexual trauma, trauma with their parents. So many people that I knew were going through that. And I was like, if they could try breathwork, how would they feel? So that was my path into facilitation.
Mm. If people understood what breathing actually does on a fundamental level,
Mm.
would we all practice it every day?
I would like to think so as a facilitator. I think the beauty about breathwork is that it's this amazing mix of science and spirituality. So we're able to access different levels of the divine. There's quite often times in my sessions where people will meet loved ones that have passed away and they have messages for them and they leave with this beautiful feeling of comfort and joy and presence for life and for gratitude for life that these people have met them in the void and they're able to feel somewhat whole again from that. But on a scientific level, obviously, there's so many benefits to a practice as well, like oxygenating our blood. We can increase our creativity by up to 500%. So if you work in creative or you're an artist, again, it's a really beautiful practice to build in. And we can become more emotionally and self-aware, which is essentially what helps us form a new earth movement when we're able to really all become aware of our emotions and emotional regulation, it does make the world a better place.
Mm. Yeah, you're touching upon it here with the spiritual, but also from a um, physiology level. They talk about like consciously, I heard this in one of your posts, if you consciously change your breathing, you can change your physiology. And you talked about how to alkalize the blood uh, and some other aspects. What are all the aspects physiologically that can change in your body because of the breathing?
Mm. So, one of the most powerful ones that I love to share with people before I do a session is essentially when we move through things like anxiety and we have our fascia and our muscle that is always in this like really locked state whenever we are anxious.
Mm.
But when we move into a breathing practice and we're breathing in a conscious way and it's in a more deep way, we're able to like slowly part away that fascia, which is storing like all of the trauma, all of the anxiety, all of the grief, the stress. And we're opening it up on an energetic level as well, where we're actually able to then release that old stagnant energy and invite new energy in. So I think that in itself is really powerful. And when I actually learned that, I was like, wow, I can feel like when my shoulders are really tense, or I can feel when I'm like not breathing properly and I'm like really clenching my stomach, for example. But when you move into that space of allowing the muscles and the fascia to breathe, so much can happen within the body. So detoxifying our cells, we can alkalize our blood. So if you're moving through like a health issue as well, it's really important to have your blood as alkaline so it can heal. Also within the brain, we're able to regulate our nervous system through the messages that we're sending through our type of breathing as well. So that's why I find it so powerful.
Mm. Super powerful. I think we're just touching the surface on what's out on the internet and what's
Yeah.
actually going on. I know in your sessions with your clients, you're creating a safe space for them in order for them to be able to surrender and let go of certain resistance. How important is that in the breathwork sessions? That it's a safe space, safe container, and people are feeling safe to let go of resistance of any kind.
I honestly think it is the most important thing. And the reason why I share that is because I have seen breathwork sessions before where there's been about 50 people and one facilitator. And for me, in my personal practice and in a professional practice as well, I believe that when someone is going through an emotional release, it's very important for someone to be there to support them. And essentially, there's people that are releasing trauma that they've never touched on before. So the power in that itself is huge. So the number one priority is that they feel safe with me to be able to do that as a facilitator, and that they're safe enough to be able to feel like they're allowing themselves to feel heard and seen, which they've suppressed for so long. And I think we live in a culture of emotional suppression, right? And I think it's really important that we allow these people and ourselves to release emotions, because that's when we start to feel things like anxiety, grief, pressure, and we experience those bodily ailments as well that aren't going to benefit us in the long run. So for me, it's pivotal, and I think it's also part of being integral as a facilitator as well. I think I prefer the smaller intimate groups because you can move into a space as a facilitator of feeling like the bigger you go, the more you'll be seen, the more your ego will be fed. And actually, for me, I really sat with myself and I was like, safety is paramount, and the experiences of who are coming to me is number one.
Makes a lot of sense. I like that. What do you think makes you different in the way of you being so well able to hold safe space for people and making them feel safe?
Mm.
Like your presence and your energy is one thing, but I'm sure there's other aspects when it comes to tapping into source or any kind of like Kundalini related uh, abilities. How would you describe that part of it?
I think one thing I've noticed is the relatability side of things. So I always share my story about PTSD and where I came to with that. And the vulnerability around that allows for other people to open up and know that it's a safe space for them to be able to share as well. I also think as well that I always enter a space with no judgment. So, and I set the tone of that at the start of a session. So I know that naturally as humans, we can judge others. It's not within everybody's nature to enter into a space and immediately have no judgment. So I always set the tone that people will be releasing. And if they are, then it's really important that in the space you send them love and not judgment, because you're only just then going to fill their energy body with judgment, right?
Yeah.
So that would be the second thing. And the third, I feel like when I open up my channel, there are a lot of important practices that I've learned along the way that only open me up to white light and the purest of light. And admittedly, when I first went into being a facilitator, I was quite naive. I was doing protection prayers, but they definitely could have been stronger. And I think now the energy that I set around this space is that of pure consciousness, pure divine light. And I specifically say that I'm not inviting any negative forces into the space of healing. And it's made a huge impact on my sessions as well. And I think keeping those sessions intimate for me is also important as well. So everybody's got that safe, energetic care and attention that they need.
Yeah, intimacy, relatability, super important. How do you think you got good at this, at inviting more of the purest light and all of those stuff?
Mm,
What did that practice look like for you?
yeah, I think it's been a journey actually. I think strangely enough, when I moved into the breathwork space, it did feel as though I had done something similar in a previous lifetime.
Mm.
And the same with astrology. It was as though the information was already in the field. And it was a case of me bringing that back up to the surface and working with it in this current timeline and lifetime. And my breathwork mentor said to me at the end of my exam, he was like, "Oh, because you're already a facilitator." And I was like, "I'm not." And he was like, "Oh," he was like, "That's so interesting because it feels like you've done this before." So then it was almost about really clearing my own channel to then understand where I'd received these codes, where I'd been beforehand, what practices I'd done, and how I could then bring that forward. So I'm very conscious now of the food that I eat and what I put into my body, how I prepare for session, how I close sessions, the water I drink. And I think it all comes down to that actually. So it's been a journey. And at first, it wasn't like that. At first, it was, very much like feeling out the breathwork realm. But then as I started to open up as a facilitator, my channel opened up more then. So it kind of guided me in that direction.
Mm. We'd love to go deeper into this later on here with past lives and how
Mm.
certain things from our past lives is moving on to this one.
Yeah.
Um, let's finish up the breathwork section here, where for people who are interested in breathwork, but maybe are a little bit scared of what might come up, what would you tell them?
Mm. So I get this question a lot in terms of, I think people are very afraid of the unknown. And I think that's natural. It's in all of us to feel that way. But ultimately, the magic of the practice is in this surrender. And we're always going to have to feel into the unknown to grow. And the reason why it feels so terrifying is because we've never done it before, or because our soul is resistant to it because it feels so scary and so unknown. But that's where our growth is. It's outside of our comfort zone. And so we're actually just breathing, and we breathe when we're born, and we take our last breath when we die. And that's what I always like to remind people, is that we actually breathe in a similar way when we're brought into this earth. It's just societal conditioning and everything that we're taught to believe essentially brings our breath from our diaphragm up to our chest and traps it. So we're actually just rewinding time a bit and going back into that state of when we were first born. So I feel like it's completely relatable and understandable when people are scared of breath work. And I think, we have a lot of social media content that it looks terrifying as well. But actually, we never know how the experience is going to go. It could be completely euphoric and magical. It could be a bit of a trauma release. And if it is that, then it's really coming into acceptance of the parts of ourselves that we don't want others to see.
Makes perfect sense. Yeah. What are some of your favorite daily breathwork practices for different purposes? And I noted a few down here that I gotten from your social medias and researching about you. Conscious connected breathing in the morning, breath of fire for breathing before the gym, heart coherence breathing, and then there was also one that I thought was fascinating. Someone had a chest infection, and it was called Nadi Shodhana, alternate nostril breathing.
Mm.
Maybe you can expand on a few of those or any others that I wasn't mentioning.
Yeah, so the Nadi Shandana one is my favorite. It's ultimately, we have two main energy channels in our body. So we've got the masculine and the feminine, the sun and the moon, and the feminine being on the left and the masculine on the right. And quite often when we wake up in the morning, we're out of balance. So there's a dominant one which is taken over. So the alternate nostril breathing actually allows for us to bring ourselves back into balance. And it's super simple practice, and it can be done for about 10 minutes. But it's a practice that I learned in India, and it's rooted in pranayama, and it's rooted in what the gurus teach. And for me, it's so simple but so impactful. So that's one of my favorites that I often do. I don't do breath of fire as much now, but for anyone who is looking for a quick energy boost, or also just for an amazing detoxification of their body, you can do the breath of fire. And it's very quick exhales through the nose. And it's really good for actually detoxifying your lungs as well. So if you're suffering from, like a chest infection, or if you're feeling as though you just need like a little bit more power in the morning, again, that's a really beautiful pranayama practice from India that I learned as well.
Mm.
The conscious connected, I love to do only for 15 minutes. So I don't do a 40-minute practice in the morning, because quite often I think you really have to prepare yourself and bring yourself into that state of knowing that you're going into a breathwork practice. So quite often in the morning, I have things to do during the day. So I like to do that practice to regulate my nervous system. But for the whole kind of journey and experience, I think it's really important to take time, for example, like 40 minutes out of your day when you feel ready for that. And it's not, getting up and essentially going to work or getting on with your day. And that's kind of how I blend that together now. So I wouldn't say the 40 minutes is for me necessarily in the morning, but definitely 15 of that really helps.
Mm. I love the way of viewing this now, where breathwork can really be used in so many ways.
Mm.
Like whatever you want to improve or increase or get rid of, whether it's get rid of anxiety, get rid of stress, get rid of an irregulated nervous system, try to regulate it more, get more energy, get more focus, get more presence. so many. Same with like me sitting in the ice bath. Like it might be tough in the beginning, but then I can regulate myself and yeah, I can endure anything, right?
Yeah.
And feel calm just from an inner state of things
Yeah.
coming from within rather than outward.
Hmm.
So yeah, super cool. And I think so many people will enjoy this as they dig deeper into this. Like, how can I use breathwork? How can I specifically use it in a certain way that might be helpful for me?
Yeah.
Breathwork is also a lot about like embodying who you really are and want to be. Would you say there's a process for people to embody who they really are?
Definitely, yes. I personally believe and feel that a lot of us have limiting beliefs from childhood, from society, from even quite recently, like limiting beliefs can pop up at any time. And I think breathwork, you're able to get to the root of them and start to completely reframe the subconscious mind with something so simple as breathing. And I think it's similar to shadow work, right? It's almost like moving into that real vulnerable space where in a breathwork practice, we allow ourselves to be seen and heard at our most vulnerable. And it's really that remembrance of what our soul wants to be without those limiting beliefs on a soul level, and where our soul wants to go without that ego distortion of, I need to be here to feel worthy. So I think breathwork brings us back to that root, and it allows for us to just be present with what is, with our emotions and whatever comes up at that time. And that was the same with my journey. Like it was a journey of like going into the subconscious with breathwork and really, really figuring out why my soul was put onto this earth and what it felt for me to be free. And I found that in the practice. And I think it really allows for us to do that and how we then move forward in life as well.
Right. In order to move forward with further alignment and all of that, it's important we let go of past traumas, past limiting beliefs.
Yes, absolutely.
How can shadow work help someone with that?
Mm,
What is shadow work?
yeah. So shadow work is a concept that was developed by Carl Jung. And it's really about meeting the deepest and darkest parts of yourself and coming into acceptance of those. So, for example, you know, quite often a lot of us have this idea of perfectionism, right? That we need to be perfect to be accepted, that we are striving for almost an impossible goal. Like perfectionism doesn't exist, it's an illusion because we're trying to reach this goal that we're then perpetuating the cycle of perfectionism. So it's really about meeting the parts of ourselves where we know that the ego has taken over and our soul is starting to be like, hey, like, this isn't me. Like, this is the ego. So, speaking openly and vulnerable as well about the darkest parts of you that you might not like. So, we might have been through heartbreak and we might have a lot of shame around that, but ultimately it's coming into releasing that shame and then accepting the part that we played in that heartbreak, for example. So, not blaming and shaming other people for essentially what our actions have been at that time, and making friends with that version of ourselves as well.
Yeah. Shadow work is this related to the dark night of the soul? Is the dark night of the soul one of your most darkest periods where a lot of shadows has been appearing in your 3D
Mm.
reality, or is that correctly interpreted?
I would say possibly yes, actually. And I think that's actually a really beautiful way to look at it because I think when you go through a dark night of the soul, you are bringing up some dark parts of you, which is essentially the shadow.
Mm.
But ultimately, we have light and dark to all of us. But I think quite often, especially in the spirituality space, we tend to mask that. So there's a lot of love and light that goes on, and that's beautiful. And I think it's amazing that we can think in this way. But ultimately, our shadow will start to kick up a fuss when we ignore that part of us and we try and mask it with different masks we put on, or the mask of love and light, and we need to take the mask off and be like, there is probably still some work to do here. Like, how are we projecting those wounds onto other people? How are we showing up in relationships where the shadow might pop up and then somebody else doesn't feel great from the actions that we've taken from our shadow?
Mm.
So it's really, again, like a remembrance of self, and a knowing that actually, if you come into acceptance with your shadow and you work with your shadow and you understand the parts of you that might not be so perfect and might not be so pristine, we start to become more emotionally aware. We have improved relationships, and we're able to emotionally regulate so much better because we're like, right, I can catch my shadow now. I'm not going to let it run to the point where it destroys a relationship, or, it's the ego's trying to be fed. It's ultimately like a, yes, this is me and I accept it, and I'm catching it in that moment, and I can start to then reframe that.
Mm. You work with people in these areas all the time. So for anyone who's interested in your world and maybe are relating to everything that's been said so far on this podcast, of like, okay, I have certain traumas that I want to work on. I have certain shadows that I want to heal. Maybe I want to work with Joe. What are a few examples of how people would come into you and how you would start with them? Obviously, it depends on their situation and everything, but a little bit of a sneak peek of how that could look like potentially.
Yeah. So it's interesting because I feel like a lot of the clients that I've worked with, it all starts from self-worth. So a lot of the time it starts from low self-worth, but they're almost trying to reject that part of them that doesn't feel worthy and be in this space of, but I'm okay, and I'm still like really good at this and this. And it is then a distortion because the ego is like, I can still do this and I'm going to like charge ahead. But the soul is like, no, there's work to do here. So it's really about identifying what has happened in childhood, which is huge. It's also about identifying things that have happened along the way to the soul. So whether that's heartbreak, grief, a particular trauma, and then identifying how they want to feel on a soul level. If none of that existed, how they would like to feel in the future on a soul level. So we can then get them to that point of coming into acceptance with the darker parts, but ultimately getting them into a space of feeling worthy, regardless of the validation that they might have been seeking. And it's so often that we seek so much validation from external sources as well. But the breath work and the shadow work brings you into a space of understanding on a deep level that you're already whole. So we go through a process of that identification, and then we move into a space of using breath work and body work to start working and reprogramming the subconscious and the body on a somatic level, so that we're releasing the energy and stagnancy through the body, but we're using the breath work as well to get into the subconscious mind. Because I think that in our culture as well, there's a lot of mindset work. It's a lot about doing the mindset work, doing the manifesting, doing the meditation from the mind. But quite often we can reject the body, and the two are supposed to go hand in hand together to really get into the root and release the trauma.
Yeah. I agree, like you say there. I think there's an imbalance of too much talk about the mindset, rather
Yes.
than the body. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm. Do you think everyone has a soul's purpose and a life mission of sorts?
I do. I do. I feel like it really depends what defines soul purpose and what that means to you, I guess, as a human. But I think quite often, a lot of the time, sometimes I see in people's birth charts that their sole purpose is just to have a family or just to be a mother or, and not necessarily just actually, because that's also a huge, huge thing. But what I mean is that I think quite often the word purpose is now led us to believe that it has to be like purpose and of service.
Mm.
So I think everyone has a purpose in this life.
Me too. And I'm super fascinated about it. Let's talk about astrological birth charts. How do you work with astrology on a deeper level? And are you planning your life around the energy of the moon for greater alignment?
Mm. So I don't necessarily rigidly stick to astrology in a way that I feel like I have to follow it very set, but I do look at the influences of what is happening in the cosmos for things like business and for manifestation. So I usually work with people on the basis of understanding their birth chart on a number of different levels where I'm able to explain to them how they like to be loved, what their Venus placement means in terms of a partner that they might be looking for, who's good for them or who could be good for them. Also, looking at their life's purpose, so looking at their North Node and helping them understand how they can embody their life's purpose more in this lifetime. And also looking at their limiting beliefs in a chart as well. So you're able to see where your biggest wounds are. And when I learned that myself, I was like, wow, things make so much sense. Like, I actually feel seen here, like just from my birth chart. So that's actually why I then moved into the path of astrology. It was from my own journey, similar to the breath work, which is why I also believe in it so much. But there's a number of different things that we can learn from looking at what influences were there from the planets when we were brought into this world.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. I was saying before, I got a bit of experience from you doing my reading in my astrological birth chart. And just like you said, it felt like, wow, that makes a lot of sense. I felt
Mm,
seen and understood. And I was like, yeah, on point. Like a big hell yes from a soul level. So
yeah.
super exciting. If people want to learn more about this and maybe even about themselves, like on a deeper level, what would you what would be your suggestion for them doing so?
Hmm. I would say the first step is actually a birth chart. So I think horoscopes are awesome and I do love looking at my horoscope. And like I said, I was very heavily involved in that from my mother as a child. However, we get a much deeper read on our soul and ourselves through a birth chart reading. So, really exploring what influences are over different houses in our chart. So, looking at the planets that were in alignment when we were born, how that can influence us moving forward, and then how we can also work with those energies as well. So, I remember when I first found out that I had a Pluto placement in my first house. And as a child, I was always like, I never could quite fit in. Like, I was always like the odd one out. I was very quiet. I was very into like astrology. And, I don't think people could really resonate at the time. And I always felt like there was this like misalignment, like as though my soul wasn't meant to be in my body as a child. And then I read my birth chart and I was like, oh, I had a Pluto placement in my first house, which is the house of self image. And it means you're always going to feel this powerful force of Pluto, which brings you like transformation through self and through self image. So that's where I could tell that the influence was then coming from. And then I also discovered that my North Node was in the house of communication. And again, as a child, I was sent into this life being the shy child. So I didn't want to talk, I didn't want to communicate with many people. Quite often, I was called like a mute in school because I just couldn't resonate with other children, or it was a very few amount of children that I could resonate with. And I think in society as well, it's quite often that we are conditioned to believe that people who are actors and singers, like the introverts sometimes get a little bit lost, I guess. And when I found my North Node was communication, I was literally like, oh my God. Like for me, it was huge because it was then a real journey of really unpacking my throat chakra, really sitting with myself and picking apart all of the limiting beliefs that had held me back from being expressive and vulnerable and speaking openly to people. And then when I actually started to move into using my voice, everything started to align. So presenting to breathwork groups and hosting retreats and things like that, it was as though the universe just went woof and it was like everything just shot upwards. Whereas everything before that always felt very misaligned, especially working in London in media and being sat at a desk all day. I just felt as though my soul was like, this isn't right. So then understanding that North Node was really, really powerful. So I would say to start there.
Yeah. I think you're really good at using your voice today.
I mean, there are times, where it like still catches me out. And I think there are times when things can feel pretty raw because sharing it as a child was very uncomfortable. So then learning to share the deeper, darker parts of myself was a journey, so, and I'm glad I've arrived.
Yeah. Glad to. And yeah, I resonate with so many things you said, feeling different as a child and also, yeah, having this sense of being an outcast along the way. But
Yes.
it kind of takes me to my next question also, where I don't know how it was for you. I'm super curious on your evolution there. Obviously, you were interested in astrology from a young age. For me, I was always trying to learn about myself. And it became this thing where the first thing I discovered was more like 16 personalities tests. Then I went to Enneagram, then numerology, then human design, and then now recently astrology, and now I'm fascinated about that. How much do you know about these other aspects of, well, human design and numerology or Enneagram? Like, do you think that's valuable for people to look into that? Or is it, let's go straight away to the birth chart, astrological birth chart?
I actually think they're all really valuable tools. And it's so interesting that you say that because I only recently discovered the personality test that you mentioned. So it's almost like where you started, I've ended in a strange way. But I feel like they're all really valuable because it gives you that allowance and acceptance of understanding yourself on a deeper level. And we don't necessarily have to use these things as gospel, but I think actually they really move us into more of a place of, that makes sense, or I can work with that and see how that goes. And maybe as if I understand that I am like a manifesting generator and I manifest from my sacral, like I can actually work with that and see if that makes a difference. And it all kind of brings us back into that state of presence and acceptance of what we are at that soul level. So, yeah.
Yeah. Like so far, during the last 10 years since I discovered this, on all those different aspects, like I haven't heard one person say that no, that's off. That's not me.
Yeah.
Everyone is saying that's so on point. Makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I feel like I know myself a lot more, or I know what I always knew. Like it clicked now,
Mm-hmm.
and they know how to be more in alignment with themselves. Really.
Yes, absolutely.
Without self-awareness, do you believe one can truly live a, how should we say it, like an amazing life, or maybe not amazing is the right word, but in a life of alignment to your highest purpose, to your, finding your true self? Is that possible without a lot of self-awareness?
I wouldn't say so. I feel as though the ego can only take you so far before the soul becomes exhausted.
Yeah.
So I think we can wear all of the masks that we want to without being self-aware that that is our ego. But ultimately, the soul is going to start to rattle, and it's going to feel, and our inner child is going to feel unsatisfied by the masks that we're wearing. And I think, again, it's self-awareness is that acceptance of the light and the dark, and the improvement of ourselves, not just for us, but for others that we interact with, that we enter relationships with, that we communicate with. And I think that then ripples out on a collective level as well. So I think when you are self-aware and you're willing to ultimately meet those parts of yourself and do the self-improvement, the inner work, and meet your inner child, it then causes a ripple effect, because if you can talk about the darkest parts of yourself and be vulnerable, you are giving somebody else that capacity to do the same. So I think, like I said, we can wear these masks and we can have the ego take us so far, but does that really help us in any way? And does that really help the collective in any way?
Mm-hmm. I agree. What does deeply aligned mean to you?
That's a good question. Wow. I feel like being deeply aligned is deeply following your soul. So deeply following, and it's hard, right? Because I think the ego is sneaky. So the ego will drop in and tell us that we're in alignment. But actually, the alignment comes from, and there's that difference actually where you know you're not in alignment when you're forcing and you're pushing. And you know you're not in alignment when you feel like you're hitting up against a brick wall. But you know when you're in alignment when you move into something that feels as good as breathing. And it feels as though the universe, you don't even have to try, like the universe just naturally accelerates you.
Mm.
And I think that is alignment. But also on the other side of the coin, I feel like, I mean, I could talk about this for years, but honestly, like as part of my journey, the alignment has been the acceptance of the shame and the guilt that I've felt, the anxiety that I've so often repressed down, and coming into that version of myself where the alignment comes from being able to own your power, like own your voice, like own your vulnerability, and own the person that you are on a soul level. So not the ego that wants to be owned and validated, it's the soul and the inner child that is really the most important part.
Yeah. Yes. Seeing yourself in, let's say, 1 year or maybe 2 years or 3 years, whatever timeline you feel is right. But if you're 10 out of 10 in alignment, deeply aligned, what do you see for yourself in the future? Like, how does your life look like? What are you doing on a day-to-day basis?
Mm. So I know deep down that my soul is one of freedom. Absolutely. I think for me, I feel most free when I travel. It's where I expand my mind. I can talk and learn about other cultures. I can experience what we're sent into this earth to experience, which is life and the nature around us, the different people that we meet, the colors, the foods that we experience. And for me, whenever I travel, that's when I feel most at home. So I think if I was to look ahead, and it's interesting because I'm always kind of in this like conflict with myself where I'm a Taurus, so I love stability. But the Scorpio in me is like, no, I want the exploration. So I've came into acceptance now that I'm like, I can have it both. And I think we so often feel like we can only have one or the other. So for me, the ideal situation would be still being of service, still guiding people through shadow work, while also being integral and still moving through my own shadow work process, because I don't think that will end. That's lifelong. So still guiding people through that process with breath work, but also working with the community side of things on retreats and really fostering that space of acceptance and love and connection through retreats and rituals and practices in retreats as well.
Mm.
So I think that's kind of the work side of things, but ultimately on a personal level, I know I was born to be a mum, and I really had to sit with myself recently and say to myself, when you bring a child into this earth, the freedom is going to be less, like the freedom's going to have to go. So it was about meeting those deeper parts of myself actually to be like, you're going to lose some freedom, like, and you have to come into acceptance of that. So for me, the creation of that family is very important, and being with a partner that is a provider and is very much in his masculine energy, who is able to look at the depth that I hold and actually feel inspired by that and not in fear of that. So, a real creation of that family unit with the ability to be able to travel as well.
Mm.
So, looking at possibly a home in Bali, a home in Europe, and creating that real like lifestyle that sometimes I think can feel quite impossible to some because we're so conditioned to believe it's one or the other. But actually, I believe that that's fully possible. So, yeah, I think family is really important to me, and raising my children also in a world where it's of no judgment and acceptance, or at least in our family world, that's how it is. And in a world where they feel like if they want to be introverted for a day, that's okay.
Mhm.
Like, like if they meeting those parts of themselves that they don't have to shame because society tells us that it's different or it's wrong,
Mm.
and understanding themselves on a deeper level where they know it's okay to be vulnerable and connect with others in that way. So I think ultimately a partner that can support that is paramount for me, and someone who can really move into that fatherhood role of what is good for our family, but also on a collective level as well.
Yes, fully agree also. Yeah,
Mm.
on all of those things. We touched upon a lot of things. Is there anything else you would like us to touch upon and speak further about?
Honestly, I feel like we've touched it all.
We covered a lot, yes.
We did, yeah. Um, really, truthfully, no.
Awesome.
I feel very at peace.
I just love the aspect also you talked about your voice. And I think you're so good at expressing your voice in a way where you can be vulnerable and lead by example in that way. that we all have certain things we need to work on. We all come from experience that was less good in a moment.
Mm.
And yeah, that is really portraying an example for everyone else to relate, to resonate, to be able to feel vulnerable and transparent themselves. And I think that that is your gift of like using your voice in that way, where others can feel free to do that as well.
Thank you. I really feel your words there as well. I think it's beautiful that you've reflected that back, because there have been times where ultimately I have really struggled, and even quite recently, actually, in India, when I went with Ray to work with the children in the schools, there was a moment where the headmaster, like the principal, sat me down and he was like, "We find you like really inspirational." And he was like, "You're an inspirational woman for the girls." And I don't actually think my soul, well, I think my soul knew, but I think my ego couldn't quite believe it. I think my ego was like, "No, like that's still not true." And he was like, "Would you say like a few words on stage in front of 2,000 people?"
Mm.
And my inner child was screaming inside. She was like, "Don't do this to me. Like, you cannot do this. Like, you're not ready." And actually, I think with my voice, it's been a process. So it's been a coming into acceptance of the really shy Joe and like letting her lead the way, rather than my ego storming ahead and being like, "You can talk and be in front of 2,000 people." But at that time, I knew it was my ego talking. And actually, I had to really sit with myself and be like, "I will accept going up to say a few words, but it will be a few words." And that is what little Jo is comfortable with and what she wants to do,
Yeah.
rather than the ego that would have said, I'll stay up there and talk for a long time. So, and I think especially with children and the work that we're doing there, I think it's so important that they understand that part of things as well, that, you know, they don't have to be the loudest in the room. Like sometimes the most powerful minds are the ones that quietly observe and don't say much at all.
Yeah.
So I think them understanding that as well, and understanding emotional regulation, is paramount for a new earth, because if we can emotionally regulate ourselves as children, and we have the tools and the techniques to be able to do that from so young, which I wish I had, then that's when we move into a space of people being less reactive, people, potentially or hopefully a decline in things like murders and world disasters that are pretty rife. So yeah, in short, it's been a journey, and it always will be.
Yeah. One to be proud of and enjoy. We talked about, the ego. The ego wants perfectionism, right? And you going up there on stage and not having to be perfect is really leading by example, showing the way of, hey, we also talked about freedom, like freedom of expression in any way one wants, where can come across as, yeah, imperfect in whatever way that means, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's what's so beautiful to show by example, that, hey, anyone can come up here on stage or be, yeah, expressing themselves in the way they genuinely are.
Yeah, and that's huge. And I think it reminds me of when the principal said to me, I was like, "But I'm going to cry." Like I could feel myself like crying, because it was also my last day in India and I'd spent a week with these like beautiful children who just show you the highest form of unconditional love. And I was very, very emotional. And I said to him, I'm going to cry. And he was like, "But that's the power."
Mm.
Like, or not even the power. He was like, "That's what we want to see." He was like, "That's where your strength is that vulnerability as a female as well, in front of other females who might often suppress their vulnerability and think it's not okay to be emotional." He was like, "That's the answer." So knowing that actually then really helped shift my mindset.
Mm.
And I had a conversation with James that you know, as well.
Yeah.
And we had a really beautiful conversation around being seen. And he said to me, he was like, how can you put the ego to one side and understand that whatever you're saying is being of service? It's not about you, it's about who you're sharing the message with. And I think actually when I learned that, I was like, wow, there is a real difference in how you deliver your words and how you show up for the world rather than yourself, right?
Yeah. Thinking about James now, where like one of his questions that I really love is, what would you do if you loved yourself? Or what would you stop doing if you loved yourself?
Mm,
And relating to this, it would be like, you would be loving that little girl and accepting that it doesn't need to be perfect coming up here. I just need to be genuine
yeah,
and vulnerable and say a few words. And at the same time, if I love myself, I would want to say a few words to impact others because I love others and I want to contribute to others.
exactly that. And I honestly feel as though the shyest parts of you, I think we think, oh, I can't be shy.
Mm.
And it's almost like we try and suppress the shyness.
Yeah.
And actually, there are so many people in this world that are shy. And actually, being shy is beautiful. We're just more observant of the world, or not even more so. We're just essentially more reserved in our nature, but observing and understanding things with clarity before we feel the need to say something. So I think actually understanding that and really nurturing the inner child in us is so important, because our inner child will rattle if we don't, and it'll get our attention in a really intelligent way, and it'll tell us through our body if we're pushing ourselves too hard. And then that's when you can distinguish between the ego and between the child inside of you that you're essentially pushing down. So I think learning that and understanding that as well is a really beautiful gift in itself, because you're able to meet that part of you as well.
100%. Where can people find you if they want to learn more about you?
So I would say Instagram is the best way. So it's Davis, Davis, and 2 underscores on the end. And you can click through to my website from that as well. And yeah, that's the best form.
Amazing. I have one more request for you. We're trying to do this where one guest can ask a question to the next guest without knowing who that guest is going to be. You can also think about it. Doesn't need to be to the guest. Could be to the listeners or anyone really. So, do you have a question that you would want to ask?
I do actually. What is your love language?
That's a good one. That is a good one. That's also like thinking back to like initially one of my, for most of us, the beginning of self-awareness.
Yeah.
Really.
Love languages are beautiful. And I think we don't have to like box ourselves in with one, right? Like there are so many that we can experience with different people as well. So what is yours?
Mine is affirmations. It's called, the vocal.
Mm-hmm.
And it was one of those things where you learn about it. For me, it was learning from a romantic relationship kind of angle.
Yes.
But eventually, it didn't take me long to understand, wait a minute, that's my highest love language. And how am I speaking to myself?
Wow.
Like, yeah, I can do a little bit better there.
So powerful. A mirror.
Really, a mirror.
Wow. And it's so interesting that you share that as well, because of your childhood and feeling introverted.
Yeah, exactly.
It's just crazy, you know?
Mm.
Wow.
This has been a pleasure, Joe. Thank you so much for coming on here.
Thank you for having me. It's been awesome.
Let's do it again another time.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
You're so welcome. Thank you.